Hi folks, I'm Chris McGuire from Blue Roof Orchard, and I'll be talking to you today about using the Cordon Trellis method for growing currants and gooseberries. A little background about myself and our orchard. My wife Yuli and I have a commercial organic fruit farm in southwest Wisconsin. We've been here for about 20 years. We initially started out growing mixed vegetables actually, and that was our primary crop mix for about 15 years. Currently, our main crop is apples. We grow about 3.5 acres of those, in addition to the berries that I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to start off by describing what the Cordon Trellis method actually is and why you'd want to use it, and then talk about trials we've done on our farm testing it out. So for context, most currants and gooseberries in North America certainly are grown as freestanding bushes where there's no trellis at all involved. And that's kind of allowing the plants to grow in their natural habit that they would prefer. And so these are, shrubs by nature, and they tend to constantly grow new shoots or canes from the base of the plant. And if you're growing them as bushes, this is a sort of low input kind of system. We don't have to spend a lot of time training and shaping the plants. Generally, you'd go in during the winter in the dormant season and just thin out some of the canes so the bush doesn't get really dense. And your goal there would be to remove any really old ones, more than about 3 years old, because the older canes become somewhat less fruitful and the fruit tend to decline in size and quality as the canes age. So you'd want to have sort of an even distribution of 1, 2, and 3-year-old canes always in the plant. As I said, this is a pretty simple, inexpensive method, and that's good. The drawbacks are that you tend to get plants that have a pretty dense canopy. And this makes harvest difficult because you have to pick your way through all these leaves and stems when you're harvesting. And also the dense canopy can encourage disease and maybe lead to some lower fruit quality as well. And you have to keep in mind that in growing any berry crop, harvest, if you're doing hand harvesting, harvest is very time consuming, and it's really a really dominant factor in whether you can grow them profitably is, can you actually pick them efficiently and quickly enough? And so that's a real serious drawback for growing these plants as freestanding bushes, particularly for gooseberries where the plants have thorns and that really prickly and irritating and frightening for people picking them. So the Cordon Trellis method was mainly developed as an alternative that would speed up harvest, hopefully. So this is used pretty widely in Europe, where these are fairly common fruit crops. And I should say that they're often grown for a processing market, like for juicing or making jams and jellies and so forth. And in those cases, the berries are usually picked by machine harvesting, and they're not grown on a trellis. They're grown as bushes, and they use kind of over-the-row harvesters that straddle the plants and do mechanical harvesting. But for fresh market, that's too rough and damages the berries, and so you're forced to pick them by hand, and that's when this Cordon Trellis method is frequently used in Europe. And the idea here is that you'll train the plant to a much narrower canopy where there's less, it's just not as dense, and you can pick more quickly, and maybe also reduce some of the disease that you're likely to find in denser plants. So the basic premise is that you train the plant to one or several permanent vertical stems. They're called the cordons, and they're more or less permanent. They should just stay there forever. And then these cordons will produce horizontal branches that grow off of the cordons, and that's where your fruit is produced. And through various pruning manipulations, you're sort of constantly renewing and recycling those horizontal branches, so they're not permanent. And I should say that when you do this method of growing them, you're basically fighting against the plant's natural tendency, which is to grow into a bush with a lot of canes. And so you constantly have to cut out new canes near the base of the plant that the plant is trying to send up. There's two main techniques used in Europe for pruning plants on the cordon trellis method. And the first one, which I'm personally familiar with, is the Dutch technique, and that's outlined in these diagrams here. Starting on the left, the first picture shows what a plant would look like at the beginning of the growing season. You've got your your vertical cordon shown in black here, and these three green lines represent branches that grew in the previous year. As the growing season goes on and it gets into spring and summer, the plant will grow some new branches, shown as the thin green lines, and it will produce fruit on the thick branches that were produced in the previous year. After harvest, the grower then goes in and cuts off these year-old branches that have already fruited, and they're gone. Only the current year's growth remains on the plant, and these branches will fruit in the following year. So, any given branch has like a 2-year lifespan. It grows 1 year, it fruits the next year, and it gets immediately cut off. And you're constantly aiming to have, production every year by growing some new branches every year and cutting off some branches every year. Here's a picture of a gooseberry plant, trained in this way, just to give you a general idea. You're having these long branches that are producing a lot of fruit, and they'll be promptly cut off. The alternative to the Dutch technique, I should say, is called the English pruning technique. And in that system, you're having basically a lot of short branches, and you never actually cut them off. You just every winter you go in and shorten the branches again, so they never allow them to get very long. I'm not personally familiar with that system. It's not something we've used at our farm, but it is an alternative. You can read about it, online and so forth. So on our farm, we've been doing some small-scale plantings of currants and gooseberries for a number of years, and we were intrigued by the cordon trellis method as a way of speeding up harvest primarily. And so with some grant funding for an on-farm research project, we established a trial planting of both currants and gooseberries and growing 4 varieties of each crop, and growing them each trellised and untrellised side by side. And we measured how much labor it took and what the yields were and what the costs were for plants and materials to get the plantings established. And we were essentially trying to evaluate whether this was a viable production system on our farm. So, a brief summary of our growing methods are in the freestanding bush plots. We planted the plants 3 feet apart. It's pretty standard. In the trellised plots, the plants were twice as close, so only 18 inches apart, and that was following the recommendations from Europe. Our rows are 10 feet apart. We had a sod strip that you can see in this picture in between rows, and we kept that mowed. And then we laid a strip of landscape fabric as mulch on each side of each row, as you can see in this picture. So that's 2 3-foot wide strips of fabric, one on each side of the row, leaving that open slot along the row where the plants are. And then we laid a line of drip irrigation tubing right along the row, sort of in that slot, so the water would penetrate there and get into the soil. Here's a picture of plants about a year into the trial, so early in the 2nd year of their growth. And you can see that the habit is distinctly different between the trellised and untrellised plantings. A little bit about how we actually constructed the trellis. We were using 8-foot metal stakes shown here in this diagram, and they were spaced every 6 feet apart down the row. And we suspended a wire along the stakes near the top of the stakes and another one near the bottom of the stakes. And between these 2 wires, we suspended a bamboo stake in each place where we wanted a permanent cordon. And that was what we tied the cordon to keep it from flopping over. I mean, these plants aren't trees. They need some support to be forced into this unnatural position, essentially. Here's a picture of what a trellis planting would look like early in the spring as they're just leafing out. You can see here's the metal stake. This was an angle iron stake. And near the bottom of the trellis, there's the metal wire. You can't see the wire on the top in this picture, but you can see the bamboo stakes vertically, and you can see that they're suspended in the air. They're not actually touching the ground to keep them from rotting. And there's a metal clip you can buy for this purpose. All the details of the materials we used are in the document that's linked to in the notes underneath the video here. The other thing you can see in this picture is the cordons are fastened to the bamboo stakes with a green tape. You can apply that using a hand tool called the max tapener. That makes really quick work of tying up plants like that. Just as a sort of note of interest, here's a picture from another farm where they were trying the trellising method and using a more low-cost trellis. Here they have T-posts as the metal stakes. They do have the high wire and the low wire, but in between them, they're actually using willow shoots harvested from the farm as an alternative to bamboo. And so that's another option that's out there for folks to consider. One thing we noticed very strongly throughout our trial is that there was very big differences in how suitable different varieties were to this trellising method. Currants and gooseberry varieties have their own innate growth habits, and they don't all adapt equally well to the trellising. Here's 2 currants, and this is in the 4th year, so like early in the 4th year of growth when they're kind of basically full-sized and in their mature condition. On the left is pink champagne, which was very unsuited to the trellis. Pink champagne's sort of natural habit is to, produce a cane, or the cordon in this case, with very few branches. And so that's essentially what we had, was cordons with hardly any branches. And that's not what you want in this technique, because all the fruit is supposed to be produced on branches off the cordon. So trellis pink champagne had pretty low yield because it just didn't have enough fruiting branches. At the other extreme was Jonckheer von Tetz, which is in the photo on the right. This is just a more vigorous variety in general. Like, it really reached the top of the trellis, unlike pink champagne, which was a little bit sort of shorter and more stunted. But very noticeably, Jonckheer von Tetz produced an enormous number of branches, almost too many. It became too dense. And so it had a lot of potential to produce berries in the trellis system because there was a lot of that fruiting wood there. On the gooseberry side of things, 2 of our varieties, Hinomaki Red and Tixia, really produced very small plants, both trellised and untrellised. But in the trellis, it was particularly a glaring problem because you've built this trellis at some expense and time, and then you have these plants that are only a couple feet high, not really utilizing any of the trellis space that's available to them. By contrast, like Captivator and Black Velvet were really vigorous, large framed plants that could fill the space on that trellis and have a lot of fruiting wood there to produce yield. Here's another picture of those 2 gooseberry varieties later in the year. Again, you see Captivator really filling up the trellis, Hinomaki Red not filling up the trellis, very sparse canopy. Another issue with trellising in general is that these canes and these plants by nature are not really long-lived. That's kind of their natural growth habit to some extent, is that canes tend to die out and the plant grows new canes from the base. And that can be just from winter injury, disease, insects, maybe just sort of canes peter out naturally. Not sure of all the reasons, but you can observe it. And so in this picture, you see a currant plant or 2 where most or all of the cordons have died. And the plant might sprout new cordons from the base, or maybe not. Maybe you'd have to replant. And you could, fill up that space again somehow and get more production there. But it represents a pretty significant lost opportunity. We spent a lot of time building that trellis, training that plant up, and then it died after a year or two. That sort of calls into question the investment in time and material. By contrast, in a freestanding bush plant, you've got a lot of canes, and every year a couple of them die. It's not a real major loss. You can kind of just expect that and roll with it. Okay, so let me talk about harvest. The main reason for trying this technique was to improve and speed up harvest. So what did we find? Well, first of all, yield was interesting. In the currants, most of the varieties actually yielded a good bit more in the trellis plots than in the on-trellised. And this was contrary to what we'd expected. We'd sort of anticipated that the on-trellis plants would just have more canes, more wood, more surface to produce fruit. So the yield would be higher in the on-trellis plants. But that actually didn't bear out. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. Possibly, better sunlight exposure into the canopy on the trellis plants, promoted more fruiting and more flowering and fruiting. Another thing is that we pruned the on-trellis plants pretty hard. In our experience, if you have a bush plant where some of the canes are kind of sagging and lying on the ground, you get a lot of dirty, not so good quality fruit that's lying on the ground. And so we were pretty aggressive about pruning out those low-lying canes. And maybe we sort of thinned out the canopy too much on those bush plants and really reduced the yield more than we should have. The gooseberries, you can see a few different things going on in this graph. There's two varieties, the black velvet here and Tixia, which hardly produce anything at all. Not really sure what was happening there. Black velvet in particular flowered abundantly, but rarely set any fruit. Captivator yielded quite a bit more in the trellis plots, but not a big difference. Hinnomaki red fruited pretty well for a plant its size. It's a very small plant. Produced a lot more in the on-trellis plantings. And that's because of what I was talking about earlier, we think, where the on-trellis plots just had a lot more wood. The trellis plants were really just scrawny and didn't have much wood there to produce fruit. Harvest speed. Trends here were a little complicated and varied by year, but I'm looking at this graph, all the blue lines are trellis plots, the orange lines are on trellis. There aren't really noticeable consistent differences. Harvest speed was a little quicker, a little faster in the trellis plantings maybe, but not much. 2023, the pattern was a little more pronounced. We were able to pick the trellis plots significantly faster in a lot of varieties here. And I should also say that subjectively, workers preferred picking from the trellis plots. It's just easier. You didn't have to be wading and fishing through these dense canopies. The fruit is kind of displayed right there for you. This preference was particularly marked when harvesting the gooseberries, because those are thorny plants. And when you've got a dense canopy, it's very hard to reach your hands in there without pricking yourself constantly. On the trellis plants, you can really see what you're doing and be more judicious and careful about where you put your hands while you're picking. This graph here shows the sort of non-labor costs that we put into these plantings. So what we pay for plants and materials, primarily the trellis materials like the wire and the posts, also the landscape fabric and the irrigation. And the short lesson here is that trellis plantings cost a lot more to establish. Why? Because you have to build a trellis, number one, and number two, you're planting at twice as high a density, so you're paying twice as much for the plants. Overall here, you're looking at costs that are like 2 to 3 times as high for trellis plantings as for on-trellis plantings. This graph is showing the overall labor requirements for all 4 years of our study here. And the different colors in each bar represent different tasks. So I find a couple of key things here to note. One is the time spent in training and pruning the plants, and that's this gray color here in the charts. And that was pretty significant for the trellis plantings. So in this place here and over here for the gooseberries, pretty decent chunk of time. We were spending, a few hundred hours per acre over 4 years training and pruning these plants. In the on-trellis plantings, you see a pretty narrow, thin gray line. Not much time spent on pruning. It's a simple growing method. Another thing here is this brown area, which is trellis construction. Obviously, we spent some time in that in the trellis plantings, but no time at all in the on-trellis. There is no trellis. But the really big eye-opening thing here, I think, that you always have to keep in mind in growing these berries is this reddish-brown color. That's the time we spent harvesting the fruit. And that's the biggest chunk in all of the bars. So no matter what style of planting, no matter what crop it was, harvesting was always the most time-consuming part of growing them. And you may ask, well, why was it in the currants? Why was there so much more time spent harvesting in the trellis plots versus the on-trellis? And the answer is because the trellis plots yielded more. We were actually able to pick a little more quickly in terms of like pints per hour in the trellis plots, but there were so many more pints to pick that it ended up taking longer. So really, that's in a sense somewhat of a good thing, you might say. I mean, you're spending more time, but you're getting more yield and value for as well. So that's not, to my mind, this graph really emphasizes why we wanted to try the cordon trellising method in the first place. Harvesting is time consuming, trellising maybe would speed that up. And my final chart here is to try to sort of summarize everything we saw in a dollars and cents kind of way. So for the purposes of this chart, I assigned a value to our labor of $18 an hour. Maybe that's too high, maybe too low. As farmers, I think our time should be worth more than $18 an hour, but we have hired help whom we pay somewhat less than 18 in some cases, although not always. And so I sort of picked that as a kind of a somewhat arbitrary number. And so I calculated a cost for all the labor we spent in each of our trial plots based on $18 an hour. And then we added in the cost of all the plants and materials we purchased for those plots. And then divided all those costs, labor and materials and plants, divided that by the number of half pints that we picked over the 4 years. And this is intended to give sort of an idea of sort of cost of production per half pint. Now, please keep in mind that this graph does not include any sort of overhead costs. There's no marketing costs. And those are very real, important expenses on a farm, as anyone who grows commercially knows. I mean, things like buying tractors, maintaining them, paying your accountant, going to the farmer's market or what have you, all take a lot of time and money. And those expenses are not represented in this chart. But this chart does give you kind of just a direct comparison between the trellis and on-trellis methods. And what you can see here is that there's two varieties, being Champagne and over here Hinnomaki Red, where the cost of production in the trellis plots is much higher than the on-trellis. In other words, trellising isn't worth it. You spend all that extra time and money on materials and training, and the yield increase is either not there at all or it's not enough to offset that extra time. And the other 4 varieties, so Captivator Gooseberry and the 3 currants, Rovada, Yankee Von Tetz, and Blanca, it's pretty close. Like, cost of production is somewhere in the same ballpark for trellis and on-trellis. And so there's, some potential for the cordon trellis method, I think, in those varieties, especially when you think about some of the long-term aspects here. We only kept this study up for 4 years. the longer you let it go, assuming the plants stay reasonably productive, probably the better the trellising method will appear after each year if you redo these calculations, because you'll be spreading out those initial costs of establishment over a long time period. That's assuming that things like cordons dying out don't really take a toll after a while. Some other things that are a little more qualitative and hard to put a number on is that we did a much better job of weeding. So we hand weeded along the row in between the two strips of landscape fabric. The weeding job was clearly much better in the trellis plots, simply because people could see the ground and they could notice the weeds and pull them out. In the dense bush plantings, a lot of weeds went unnoticed, especially in the gooseberries where they're really thorny and no one wants to really investigate too much what's going on underneath them. And over time, weeds get established in there, including some, perennials, little tree seedlings, grapevines, what have you, and can become pretty obnoxious. The trellis plantings, we were able to keep much cleaner and weed-free. And so that's, again, something that might, over time, confer an advantage on the trellis plantings, in that you could keep them more weed-free. So some long-term considerations to add on to these numbers. One thing which we were interested in was the idea that the trellis plantings might produce better fruit, like larger berries, denser strigs or clusters. This comparison here is not from our farm. This is from the other farmer I've mentioned before in northern Wisconsin, who has tried some trellising on a very small scale, and he found much larger strigs and denser ones in his trellis plantings. However, the what makes this hard to interpret is that his trellis plots were inside a high tunnel and the on-trellis plants were outdoors. So this picture is sort of confounding the distinction between trellised and on-trellised with the distinction between outdoor and indoor cultivation. We did not observe really any significant difference in fruit size in our study, which would have been nice. Larger fruit looked nicer. They're also quicker to pick on sort of a per pound or per pint basis, but we didn't really find that result. So some overall conclusions before I end this. I think the cordon trellis has potential, but is not a proven winner in my mind on our farm. Some key things to maybe pay attention to or think about if you're considering this are, number one, choosing the varieties that are suited for it, that will use up that space, that will branch appropriately, and so forth. Number two, this is a pretty expensive, high input intensive way of growing. And that, I think, has a few implications. One is that if you don't have the time and attention and the interest to dedicate to doing this, it's probably not for you. So for example, if you're in a really diverse market farm and maybe these berries are a small part of your farm, or you have 20 or 30 other crops, vegetables and fruits that you're growing, realistically, you may not have the attention to be doing the pruning and training that you need to do in the summer. And maybe these plants wouldn't even justify it. They're just not a big enough part of your sales and your overall farm to really even warrant that kind of thought and attention. On the other hand, if you've got a few acres of these berries with a proven market, and you're really trying to make it efficient and productive, this might be something to consider, especially if you have the kind of horticultural interests that you really enjoy, this kind of pruning and hands-on work with the plants. And I think there is room for really refining those pruning and training techniques for specific varieties, and sort of working out some goals and targets, like how many branches do you want per foot of cordon, and how long should branches be, and so forth. But that's detailed work that requires a lot of interest and attention. So once again, I just wanted to point everyone to the link below this video. There is a written document that really summarizes what we did and what we learned in great detail if you want to delve into things like trellis construction and these specific yields we saw and so forth. And I welcome questions by email or comments on this video. And thanks very much for your time.